I come at this from a slightly different, um, I guess, perspective, which is that my job is often to tell other people's stories, which has all kinds of its own challenges. And I am a journalist, but I think of myself primarily as a storyteller. And I want to start with one little anecdote that was a big realization for me. A bunch of years ago, I was living in India with my wife and my two little kids. I was there on a Fulbright. And I was working on a story about a temple where all this gold had been discovered in the vaults beneath the temple. And there was a complicated legal battle about what to do with this treasure. So we're out with the family. I don't know, we're going maybe to go shopping or something. We drive in the car past this temple. And my older boy, who was 5, points out the window and says, Dad, isn't that the temple you're writing a story about? And I said, yeah, that's it, Sebastian. And he said, Dad, what's your story about? And I said to myself, well, I was actually grappling with that question at the time because I was trying to write it up for the New Yorker and I was struggling with it. And I said, well, it's very complicated, Sebastian. And he said, yeah, so what's it about? Right? Anyone that has a kid knows that you can't tell a 5-year-old. So I said, all right, my wife gave me this look like you better give it a go. So I started explaining, well, that people give these money to the temple as an offering and they trust the God to take care of it, but there's a Maharaja I tried to explain the story so a 5-year-old can understand it. And as I'm about a minute into giving this 5-year-old friendly rendition of my story, I realized that I was telling my New Yorker story completely wrong, that I was overthinking it, that I was trying to be too complicated, too fancy, too erudite, whatever, that in fact, the act of being forced to tell this story to a 5-year-old had forced me to boil the story down to its bones, to its most basic pieces. And I then made this other realization that you should really be able to tell any story to a 5 or 6-year-old. And if you can't, either A, you're telling it wrong, or B, it's not really a story. And so my kids kind of became this really important sounding board for me, that whenever I had a story, no matter how complicated it was, I would basically kind of bounce it off them and say, well, this is what it's about. And I would listen to their questions because their basic questions of why would he do that? Or that must be very hard, or I don't understand, would actually be in some ways my constellation of stars that would lead me through my story. Anyway, around 2016, I really wanted to write about the refugee crisis. As many of you probably know, there are 50 million refugees worldwide, more than any time since the end of World War II. And I was talking with my editor at the New York Times, how can we do this in a way that engages people? Because too often stories, be they of immigration or refugees, they just seem like yet another headline that just kind of glosses over us like white noise. We forget, we can't process it on a human level. And my editor had this really interesting idea. He said, Jake, what if you teamed up with an illustrator and you did it as a graphic narrative, kind of as a true comic? And we would run 8 panels each week and you would report on a family and we would, publish this in the Times. And I said, that's really cool. I have to find an illustrator, which I did. And then I said, we've got to find a family. So I called the local refugee resettlement agency here in Connecticut, and they said, hey, we've got a family that's coming in on election day, 2016. And I thought, that's kind of cool. It's kind of an important date, although like many people at the time, including my own organization, the New York Times, we had it completely wrong. Everyone thought it was 92% certain that Hillary was going to win. So anyway, the day of the election comes and I go out to this area where these 2 families, they're Syrian refugees that have been waiting in Jordan for 4 years. And they arrive and I'm there the day that they arrive and I'm watching them get out and I say a quick hello to them and my illustrator is doing his sketches. It's pretty powerful actually. And that night I go home and I'm watching the election results and I'm thinking, wow, this is really not playing out the way it was supposed to. And around 2:30 in the morning, I wake up and I see the headline, Trump triumphs. And it was interesting because at that moment, I didn't actually see that election in political terms, the starkly political terms that I might otherwise have. What I really thought about was this family. And I thought, oh my gosh, this family has landed in one country and will, in effect, wake up tomorrow morning in another country. And when I went out and met with them, there's a lot of details to the story, but my translator was also a Syrian refugee, said to me, Jake, I don't think they're going to talk to you. You're a non-Arab speaker, you're a white dude, you're Jewish. There's like all these different, and it was quite reasonable. He said, Jake, don't get your hopes up, okay? Because I think it's going to be hard to connect. And as it turns out, when I went to the family's house, I started to explain through Muhammad, my translator, what I was hoping to do and follow them around. And right away, he started telling me, he had his little daughter leave the room, and he started telling me the story of the day that he was picked up in a pickup truck by the security forces in Syria and brought to a detention center and tortured by Assad's security forces. And I was just not expecting this. And I said to Muhammad afterwards, my translator, Muhammad, is he intending to share this with me? And the guy, Isa, the father, said, if you can get the truth out there, I want you to get it out there. And we started this trust. It was actually very beautiful, I thought, because in a way, we were nationally in this moment of profound distrust, right? Where we were building a wall and we were worried about this and that. We were red state and blue state. I mean, any way you crisscross it, there is, I think we can agree, it's a divisive time in this country. And here, me and my subject, we're talking. He doesn't know who I am. I don't know who he is. But we engage in this conversation that he's going to share his story, and I'm going to try my best to share it. So I get home, and I have to now break this up into 8 panels, right? Because that's all the New York Times is giving me. And how the heck do you tell a story as complicated in this one in just 8 panels? And so I had to kind of do what I had done in India all those years ago, which was think, how do I explain this to my kids, right? How do I make my then 8-year-old and 6-year-old grasp the enormity and the intensity of the story? And I started talking to them about what the Syrian dad had told me, and bouncing off them and kind of listening to what they thought was interesting and powerful. And then I used that to boil down to my 8 story points. Each panel was a story point, so that I could tell you in 8 bullet points, this is the arc of this week's story. And they were small stories, because there's not a lot you can do in 8 panels. And then it would print. It was always quite funny, because when the Sunday Times would come out, my wife and kids would read it in like 45 seconds. And I'd be like, can you please read that again? That took me all week to create. But that was the goal, kind of simple storytelling. And the most powerful moment, both as a dad and a storyteller for me, came at the very end of the series, when the family gets a video sent to them by their former neighbors back in Syria that shows them the shambled ruins of their own home. And they get this kind of surreal experience of getting a video sent to them via WhatsApp that this is what's left of your home. And the mother had always kept the key to the house. The key was almost like a talisman, like this kind of magical promise of return. And she had held on to that key and clutched it in her palm and to her bosom. And that key meant they were going to go back to that house. And then they get this video that shows the house is no more. It's just a pile of bricks, right? And they shared, I wasn't there for the moment, but they recounted, they showed me the video. And then I went about that week, it was the last week of the comic, to show this moment. And my illustrator, Michael, did this really beautiful job of it, where they get the video, and then the last image is of the mother clasping the key in her hand. And there's a certain kind of uncertainty. Is she clasping it because she's still holding it tight, or is the key vanishing in her hand because the promise of the return of home is gone, right? I was quite excited. I thought Michael did a great job. But the test, of course, for me was I was going to show my kids. But I didn't want my kids to be like pressured. I didn't want like dad, helicoptering over them. Do you like it? Do you like it? So I wait till the Sunday Times came, and my older boy was in the kitchen reading the paper. And I was kind of in the living room looking into the kitchen, kind of spying on him. Parents, I'm sure you'll have done this before. And I didn't want him to know he was being observed, because I wanted to see, like, did he get it? And when he was done, he looked up and he turned back to me, and there were tears in his eyes. And he said, Dad, they had a home just like us. And it was such a powerful moment for me, because in a way, someone once told me very wisely, the greatest story should always be told between 2 people, the teller and the person who's hearing it. And in that moment, despite the fact that I had written this for the New York Times, this was a story between me and my son, of trying to humanize these other people's experience. And when I've done a little bit of stuff in schools, I've tried to do this same thing where I create an 8-box panel, just like I had with the Times, and I try to have the students tell a story of their own. This would be great with what Emily was talking about. What's your own story? Can you do it in 8 pictures? Or if you're not a refugee, have you ever experienced displacement? Have you had to move and go to a new school and start all over? And what did that feel like? Because I think not all of us have, of course, experienced the drama and the power of what someone like Emily has, but many of us have felt alienated or marginalized or new or strange and frightened in our own ways. And that's the universal aspect of these stories, and forcing, or not forcing, but encouraging the kids to think about it in this way and have the pictures and tell the storytelling. Because in a way, my main point here to end with is just, this is the comic, yeah. The main point to end with here, I think, is just that kids understand story. They really do, much better than we think. And if we can take a page from Emily's advice and empower them to tell their own story to someone else's, they actually understand how to do it. Sometimes they just need the go ahead to try. I want to give one other quick shout out here, which is that the Immigration Learning Center, we've turned this comic that I did for the Times into a book, which will be out in the fall. And I've talked to my publisher, and we're going to make a free digital copy available for every single person at the conference. We'll send an email out, and you can get a click and you can read the book. And then a quick plug for what the Immigration Learning Center has done. They've created a 50-page teaching packet that guides through how you can use it in your classroom. And all this is free, by the way. So I encourage you to kind of take a look at that, to use it, and I hope this was of some value to you.
Thank you so much, Jake. It's a very, very powerful story. Getting it down to the bare bones, knowing your audience, those are really, really important points. And I'm picturing in my head telling or trying to tell Emily's story visually, and seeing how that can play out in young people's minds, how they can put their own story into that kind of, into panels.
Yeah, I think that I really was resonating with what Emily said about how her story was something that empowered her, because I think that we often underestimate the power of our own narrative. And even with the Syrian family that I wrote about, they were not telling the story directly, they were telling it through me, but I watched the way that when they got the positive response from people, readers from all over the world saying, go, keep going, and passing it along to them, that they realized wow, what we've done is really extraordinary. I'm sure they knew it on some level, but there's something about sharing the story that creates this synergistic magic that we realize it allows us to realize kind of the power of our own narrative.